the first time I've been in Bangalore. I've been in other parts of India. This is the first time I've worn a wonderful garland, and I'm very pleased that I can still be wearing it. Thank you very much. But it did remind me of the story of a young Italian tenor who had to perform in Italy. Italy, as you know, are very keen on opera, and they love their opera. And the young tenor was doing his first performance in a major opera house in India, in Italy. And he started, and he sang the great aria. You know, operas have moments, and there was a great aria. Went to the front of the stage, sang his great aria, and then there was just a burst of encore, encore. So he sang it again, and there was a burst of encore, encore. So he sang it again. And the third time, they were, encore, encore. And he said, well, I'm so sorry, but if I don't carry on, we won't get through the opera. And when a man stood up from the back and said to him, you sing it again and again until you get it right. So I hope I won't have to do this again. As Mike very kindly mentioned, and thank you so much to you, and also just thank you very much to Raj for all the work that he does. It makes my life as chairman of Alpha so much easier when I know that Raj is looking after us here and doing the wonderful work that you do. And thank you for convening this early morning breakfast. Oscar Wilde said that only the dullest people are interesting before breakfast. So I hope I don't prove him right. But if you want to, I'll be like you. I don't want to disturb your myths. If you believe in a church warden that's fuddy-duddy and quiet and reserved and old school, I'll be that for you for a few minutes, and then I'll change for that. But yeah, I am part of HTB, as Mike was saying, I'm church warden, which is a senior, on the senior leadership there, and I preach there and talk a bit. But I'm also, of course, spent and still do spend time in finance in the City of London. And I wrote this book called God at Work, and the only reason I wrote it is because, as any layperson will know, pastors are bullies. They always bully us, don't they, really? They're terribly nice about it. And Nicky Gumbel is my pastor, and he said, well, you know, you've got to write this book. So I said, well, I'll only do it in obedience, Nicky. So I wrote the book. Anyway, when I was chairman of the last bank, one of the young analysts was told that he needed to come see me. So he turns to the analyst next to him and says to the analyst, chairman wants to see me. What should I do? So the young analyst says to him, well, why didn't you just Google him and just know something about the guy before you go and see him? So he Googles Ken Costa, whoop, you know, and up comes God at Work. And it's all right, I know it's early in the morning, so he turns to the guy next to him and he says, flip, the guy is arrogant. And so I've lived with this sort of joke being made with me in the workplace all the time about, oh, this is God's banker, and this is, you know, God's man. And I think, you know, one does live with that. But the whole notion of God being at work is a very important part of my life, and I think it should be a very important part of all our lives. So I would want to just start this morning by reading a verse from Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 8, verse 36, which you know very well. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? So it's a trading question, isn't it? What's the trade? What's the trade between my soul, my life, my being, and the other things that are important. What is the balancing act that is needed? And I want to just, if I may, just start for a moment by just giving a context, a bit of a context of the world in which we're living at the moment. The one thing I would like to urge you, if you have not seen it, I strongly urge you to look at and to watch the latest Beats advertisement for the World Cup. It's an extraordinary, I would have shown it this morning if I could bear the thought of England's loss. It is an extraordinary advertisement for a number of reasons. The first, it's brilliantly executed, as you would expect from one of the major marketing companies of the world, and of course Apple has just paid $3 billion to buy them. And it's called The Game Before the Game. It's the preparation before the game. And what is so significant about it, and it's the point I want to make, is that it comes to the end, and the end isn't what you would expect, which is, you know, here are Dr. Dre's, here's the best form of acoustic equipment that you can get. It's an interchange of a father with a football hero about to go and play his football for the World Cup. And it comes to the end, and he says to him, you know, there are really important things that you must remember in life. And he comes to the end and he says two things that are very significant. He says, go with God, put on the helmet of God, let God fight the battle for you, I love you. Now, these are two very significant changes, in my view, in a global perception of spirituality. 5 years ago, you could never make an advertisement like that. You would not have been thought to be relevant to the audience that you were appealing to. And don't forget, this is a global audience. This is not a particular product for a particular market. This is a global grouping of people. And what must have gone through the advertising agencies, and some of you I know have been in advertising, and you can imagine that, before a major corporation would agree to having these two, quote, soft things stuck at the end of a major advertising thing. And there are already 3 million hits to the advertisement, and it is guaranteed for success. The point I want to make is that worldwide, there is a hunger for the undefined spirituality that has eluded us for a generation. But the post-war generation grew up in the expectation that financial security would produce, and material prosperity would produce happiness. And we have seen that it has failed miserably to do so. We have seen the most amazing financial crisis that even those countries that are relatively insulated from it, like you relatively, would have suffered. But worldwide, we have not yet seen the consequences of what is going to happen as a result of this huge bailout that has to be made into every single country of the world. All are taken up by it. And I believe that the 21st century will be, like the 16th, a time in which religion is going to play an extraordinarily important role in the world of every kind of thing. I don't think there'll be a board here in 20 years' time, 15 years' time, even now, that will not have to deal with the issues that religion produces globally. And that's not just for Christians, but for Muslims, for Hindus, for whatever it is, such that the concerns of people are going to come right to the very front of the boardroom, and they will have to be dealt with, because you cannot make the mistake that we have learned from the great financial crisis. What was that? In the crisis, in my view, I can talk to you endlessly about, if you want me to, about levels of debt and borrowings and credit and all of that. But at its root was the failure of trust. And the failure of trust came about for one reason. We had a stool, And we have a stool in which there are three legs, in my view. There is the financial, I want to do well. There is the spiritual, I want to do good. And there is the ethical, I want to do right. And what happened is we took the ethical and the spiritual out. The stool was left standing on one financial spindle only, and guess what happened? It fell over. Because mankind is not made to have one thing only. It is made, we are made to be a combination of all those three things, which is what makes us essentially human. And we need to be very careful that we recognize this humanity that is part of our Christian heritage. And we need to be sure that in this new explosion of interest worldwide, we are able to make a distinctive claim for the Christian faith. And that means we need to be serious about God's work in the world. So just a little bit about me. I grew up in South Africa, so you might know what you're talking about. I grew up in South Africa. They were very difficult times. They were difficult because the entire country was divided on racial grounds. I went to a university where we were compelled to have separate, white universities and black universities. I remember vividly the day in which a great Indian friend of mine was jumped out of security headquarters in what was obviously a clear, brutal murder. We couldn't find his body. Eventually we found his body, and the funeral took place. I remember as a young student being in that place, and it was extraordinary. I mean, it was in a purely non-white area because you could not go there. But being students, we decided whether we got locked up or not. We were going to the funeral. And we went to the funeral, and as I stood there, one of the speakers, it was quite extraordinary, stood up and said, his life will not be in vain, justice will come to this country. And at that moment, there was a bolt of lightning that just hit 50 yards away from us. It was extraordinary. It was as if the heavens themselves were saying, yes. And it moved me to a great degree that. But the fact of the matter was that there was a government in place which had institutionalized a political ideology on religious grounds. And it was trying to enforce a political ideology with the backing of a warped religious activity. And I then decided that clearly this had no place. Christianity had really no place in the modern world, and that Marx was right, that actually you had to control the ownership of the means of production in order to understand a full humanity. I then went to university in England, largely because all my friends were locked up and my parents said, you better go. And there, amazingly, met Nicky Gumbel and Nicky Lee, become my three, with great friends, but also came to faith and saw that the Christian life really did have something to say about freedom, not only economic freedom, but he did have something to say about economic freedom, but mostly about the freedom that comes to us in Jesus Christ to be able to search for justice in a world where it is both political and economic and social. And that made a transformation to my life. I then became an investment banker and survived through the years for about 30 or so years, working mostly in mergers and acquisitions, ultimately being part of or having put together the sale of Harrods, which is one of our major stores in London at the time, and then went on to doing the things that I'm doing now, which is raising funds to invest in the emerging markets, which is where, of course, all your activities are. So So I come from this with years of looking at the economics and the financial background of the faith. And what we're going into is an unstable world. It is very difficult to see how the world comes through this phase of its development without a massive unemployment of young people. We could have a jobless revival of the economies, and that would produce a very serious social issue for us. I don't have to tell you that half the world's population is under the age of 24, and that 2 years ago, over 50% of the world's population now live in cities. We have seen these massive moves in our time, and therefore we need to find ways in which our faith is relevant to the people who most need it. And what do people most need in the world today? Of course they need faith in Jesus Christ, we believe that, but they also need jobs. And therefore the ability for churches and others to create an entrepreneurial background where people can begin to earn their way in the world is going to be one of the marks of the Christian contribution to society in the next 20 years. I'm quite sure of that. And of course, we're not equipped to do it. And we need to learn to do it. And the way we learn to do it is by pastors working together with the business people in their communities, and all of us finding new models by which we can see young people coming into the workplace without the failure of an entire generation. And this is an amazing generation that is coming alive worldwide to us, and we, at our peril, do we neglect them. So that, in a part, is part of just a short 2-second snapshot of the world into which I think we are going. So let me be a little more specific and talk about God. God, does he have an interest in this world? Well, of course he does. Does he have an interest in my church? Absolutely. Does he have an interest in everybody coming to faith? Well, of course he does. Does he have an interest in the workplace? Well, it's tough there. It's difficult. The harsh commercial compromises that we have to make every day. Where is God in all of this? That's the question, isn't it? I don't need any persuasion that God loves me. What I really need persuasion and assurance is that God loves me at work. Because that's where it looks as if I'm most horrible. It looks as if I'm being tough, I'm being harsh, I have to fire people, I have to pay people, I have to do deals that are, on the margin. Sometimes I have to try and keep a straight line at times when everybody else seems to be living very well on crooked lines. That's the test, isn't it? But that's the real world. That is not a fabricated world. That's the world we live in every single day. So your choice is either to emigrate out of this world, and some have, into some sort of quite wonderfully religious establishments. And I'm not talking about some very important people who have a particular calling to it, but those who just don't want to engage with the difficulties of the world and have a religion that's all's going to be well and all very nice, and you just say your prayers and do what you like during the week. Well, that is not, of course, the faith that Jesus Christ gave to us. He is passionately interested in the world around us. And the world around us, precisely because so many live in cities, is a broken world. And you can't have a healthy church in a broken world. It doesn't work. So we need to find ways in which we can encourage people, particularly young people, that the world in which they're living is a broken world, but that was the world in which Jesus came. He came and was broken for us. When he died on the cross, he reached to the furthest extremity that man would ever need to go. And for some of us, that's the workplace. It is where the toughest decisions that you're going to make are going to be made. And you need to know that Jesus is there, that he's there with us, that he is there guiding us, and that he's given us a set of principles by which to live our lives. Now, you know, it's not Google. You can't just Google a work issue and say, well, what's the answer to this or that? But you can draw the principles from the scriptures, and you can draw it from people around you who are dealing with and grappling with the same issues. And to quote James Bond, I think it's very important. You know, the world is not enough. It just isn't. And we need to be able to convey that to our younger people, to our friends, our colleagues, that, you know, you can do very well. I mean, I've had the privilege of being able to deal with some of the richest people in the world. I have flown on their jets. I have talked to them. Some have been unutterably greedy, and some of them have been amazingly generous. I've spent time with young guys, you know, sort of young students. I've seen extraordinary greed amongst them, and I've seen extraordinary generosity amongst them. It is the whole nature of our gospel transcends rich and poor, because there is one Lord. The Lord of the money markets is the Lord of mercy. The Lord of profit is the Lord of prayer. The Lord of compassion is the Lord of commerce. There is one indivisible Lord Jesus Christ. And he is not to be divided up. And we shouldn't see something as work and then something else as God, because God is at work. So when people ask me the question, well, what about work-life balance? I usually say, well, I don't understand the question. There is no such thing called work, and there's something else called life. I wish there were, but there isn't. Our work and our lives are integrated into one aspect. If your life and your work are not integrated by the work of the Holy Spirit, because the Spirit of God's great call is not to make you more religious, it's to make you more human. That's what he does, as he integrates you and me. He draws us together so that I can rightly say, my workstation is my worship station. Where God calls you and me to work, he calls us to worship. Now, of course, on a Sunday, or even as we wonderfully had this morning, we express our worship in song, yes. But for the rest of the time, we express our worship when, as a lawyer, you draw up a document that actually reflects the true intentions of the parties, or as a marketing executive. And by the way, a marketing executive is not a lawyer. You're writing something in order to sell something. You don't have to put the dullest prose that you've seen, but you have to juggle between the truth that this is the best toothpaste you've ever seen, and, well, it's a very good toothpaste, and somewhere there you draft and you get the copy for the advertising. But every time you do something that is good in that way, what happens is we strike a blow for truth. In our workplaces, every time you have a generous word for someone, we actually are able to reflect Jesus to them. I remember very well, in the midst of a very difficult takeover battle, a friend of mine was very, very stressed, and he was next to him, and I just said to him, Peter, come on, let's go for a walk. And we walked across London Bridge. I didn't tell him the gospel. I didn't preach to him. I did nothing other than walk across a bridge with him and talk to him about the birds, the water, the whatever it was, other than the deal that we were doing. You know, 30 years later, it's the one thing he still remembers. Now, I pray that this is a part of a journey that God would take him on, as indeed God has taken me on. So then I think that we need to understand that the Lordship of Jesus is the most important part of life, not just an aspect of life. And the formative, picture in my mind is that over all this period, Jesus Christ changes everything for the good, not just an aspect of your life. It's not just your church going that he changes. He changes the way you work. He changes the way you deal with your relationships. He changes the way you deal with your family. He changes your attitude in the gym when you can't get onto the treadmill that you want. And he is in every aspect of our lives the one that changes for the better. That's the first. The second is, and I think you're more advantaged here than we are, say, in London, is there's no such thing as a distinction between the sacred and the secular. There is no idea that the banker in God's sight is any worse than a bishop. That we are drawn together in one world. That we are called to our workplace. It is not a random event that takes you into the workplace. It is a plan from God to draw you into that particular place at a particular time. And we need to remember that work is holy to God, that he is interested in what you're doing. He's interested in your calling. He's interested to bless you where you are. He is interested to take you to the next stage of your life. He's interested in your money and what you do with your money. And your bank statement and your credit card statement are simply theology in numbers. They tell you what your theology is. They tell you what you're doing. You know, if your giving is right, you will see it reflected in your income statement. So we need to get to a place where we become generous in our giving to both our churches, which is where we should be in our first primary interest, and then to all the other interests that we have, that God lays on our heart, to ensure that justice comes about in the world that we're living in. There is no distinction between it. All the money is God's, which also means that he wants us to enjoy it, the money. I find it extraordinary how so often I talk to people and they feel guilty about enjoying something. You know, can I enjoy this holiday? To which I always say to them, well, you need to have what I call proportionate enjoyment. You have to enjoy. He gives us all things richly to enjoy, the scriptures say. Which means that if you've worked hard, and one of the motivations of working hard is to be able to maybe take your family on a holiday or live in a house. The issues are not what you have, it's what you do with it. You know, are you generous in welcoming people into your homes? But also, how much of it are you giving away? Because it is a holistic understanding of God, that he is interested not only in what he has provided for you, but what you and me, through his generosity to us, are able to provide in and through others, which is why money is such an important part of the kingdom. And Jesus talked about money far more than he talked about sex or marriage or any of the things that we think are terribly important at the moment. He talked about, possessions. He talked about money. He grew up in that environment. I mean, just think about it for a minute. What do you suppose Jesus was doing for 30 odd years? Oh, he was sitting at home? No, I mean, he was doing what his father would be training. He was an apprentice. He learned to build a house. He bought some wood. He sold some wood. He built a boat. He sold a boat. He built a house. The house didn't work very well because the windows were crooked and he had to deal with somebody else, and they straightened it. I mean, he was working there, which is why when he spoke to the people, he spoke as one of the people, because he knew what debt collectors and tax collectors were like. He knew who sinners were. He'd seen and he'd worked, and he knew what unjust stewards were. The Bible is just filled everywhere with people at work, with answers to their problems. If only we would open it, read it, and share it with each other. So our calling is not random. Our calling is God. And here is the great thing. What the world most needs we have. What the world most needs, we have. It needs a gospel that is good news rather than painful news, and it's a gospel that is actually reaches to all of mankind. I remember very well having a dinner with a man who was extremely wealthy. He had built a couple of companies. He became chairman of 2 FTSE companies, which are our largest companies. And he's a successful guy. And we went to lunch one day. And he said to me, he said, Ken, you know, I've done very well. And I said, yep, I think you have. And he said, you know, my life is a series of boxes. There's a box of financial success. I can tick that box. He said, there is a box of friendship. And he said, you know what? Getting to the top, I've neglected my friends. So I've made a big effort to get back to the guys I was at school with, I was in the army with, and to be friends again. I have really made an effort because the gap between us has grown. They've had teaching jobs, and I've been supposedly at the top of the pile. But I think I can tick that box. So there's a box called relationships. And I've been divorced, but I've now decided, I'm really going to make sure that the families on both sides are looked after well. And I'm making a real effort there. And I think we're winning. I can tick that box. And then he said to me, there is another box. And I don't know what to call this box. But I suspect that if I knew what was in this box of my life, it would make sense of the whole of my life. I don't know what it is. But maybe we should call it spirituality. Do you know anything about it? I said, well, I do know 1 or 2 things. Why don't we talk about it? And he was absolutely right, that once we understand that in Christ Jesus, as Paul tells us, all things hold together. It's not just that the religious stuff holds together, but everything holds together. Once we grasp that, it's the most amazingly liberating life. Because that's when you are able to feel at ease with God, at ease with your neighbor, and at ease with yourself. And those 3 things are really important. And you're being as generous as you can be. You're enjoying it, the fruits of your labor as much as you can be. And you know that you are at ease in your relationships. And I think that we need to enable a world to understand that again. That here is God who is what we have in the shape of this Jesus that is totally different from the brand that is pushed out there. The Christian brand at the moment is pretty toxic because people think that we're a whole bunch of either pedophiles or people with deviant sexuality or not, as the case may be, or that we're intolerant and we don't understand, or whatever it is. The brand doesn't look very good out there. And the reason for it is that they've never really seen as effectively as they could, and I think there is a change coming worldwide in which people will be able to look and see what we do in our work, not only what we do in our worship. And that is a critical observation point for the world to enable the world to see. I want to read something to you. I read an article in the Harvard Business Review. The Harvard Business School, arguably one of the best business schools. They would think the best business school in the world. And Professor Christensen wrote an article which had an extraordinary and explosive influence on people. The article was called, "How Will You Measure Your Life?" And I think it's a very important question. I always say to young guys who are entering the workplace, before you start, sit down and ask yourself, what do you regard as important milestones of success? Now, what does success mean for you? And it's true for you and for me. It's not always static. It changes over a lifetime, changes, as Mike was saying, in a journey that we go on. But he says this. He said he was at Oxford University, and he decided that he was going to spend an hour every night reading, thinking, and praying about why God put me on the earth. That was a very great challenge, because every hour I spent doing that, I wasn't studying applied econometrics. I was conflicted about whether I could really afford to take that time away from my studies, but I stuck with it and ultimately figured out the purpose of my life. Had I instead spent that hour each day learning the latest techniques for mastering the problems of autocorrelation in regression analysis, I would have badly misspent my life. I apply the tools of econometrics a few times a year, but I apply my knowledge of the purpose of my life every day. It is the single most useful thing I've ever learned. I promise my students that if they take the time to figure out their life purpose, they'll look back on it as the most important thing they have discovered at the Harvard Business School. If they don't figure it out, they will just sail off without a rudder and get buffeted in the rough seas of life. Clarity about their purpose will trump knowledge of activity-based costing, balanced scorecards, core competence, disruptive innovation, the 4 Ps, and the 5 forces. He says people who are driven to excel have this unconscious propensity to under-invest in their families and over-invest in their careers, even though intimate and loving relationships with their families are the most powerful and enduring sources of happiness. If you study the root causes of business disasters over and over, you'll find this predisposition towards endeavors that offer immediate gratification. If you look at personal lives through that lens, you'll see that the same stunning and sobering pattern. People allocating fewer and fewer resources to the things that they would have once said mattered most. I think it's a brilliant assessment of the underinvestment in the things that matter most and the overinvestment in the things that actually you think would have mattered least. So what do you want out of life? Firstly, I think to manage your own human capital is really important. You have to manage your life, but you have to manage your human capital. You have to decide on prioritization. What really matters to you? How will you measure success? What will be important to you? What are you going to do with your money? How will you develop your workstation as your worship station? And what is it that you want out of life? Do you want friends? You want finance? You want family? You want a future? You want forgiveness for the things that are done? You want something to fight for? All happen to begin with F. How do you do it? Well, there are 3 practical things. First, the head, the heart, and the habits. You need to be persuaded in your head that God is interested in your workplace. He's interested in you, but He's interested in you at work. You don't have to tell me, and I wouldn't dare tell you, that there is stress every day in the workplace. We know that. We know what stress does to us. We know that we're given performance either by ourselves or by, if we work with others, tasks to perform in time that is half what is necessary to do. We know that. We know how difficult it is, but we need to know in our heads that there is some overall picture in which life works for us, in which Jesus is interested in the lives that we're leading. The second is our hearts need to be warmed by the Spirit of the living God, because the Spirit of God is the one that will be the motivator, the nurturer, the guide, the alongsider, the person that is enabling us day to day to understand the works of God. And the third is we need to create habits, regular habits. Habits, I would always say, just do something for 6 weeks. Why 6 weeks? Because psychologists tell us it's 6 weeks needed to break a habit or to establish a new habit. Just take 6 weeks and just say, for the next 6 weeks, I am going to spend 10 minutes. Don't say an hour, just say 10 minutes. I know we've talked about Professor Christensen who spent his hour, but take 10 minutes with God for 6 weeks. You can always push it up after that. And either just talking to him about your work. He is interested in the work that you're doing during the day. And do me one tiny favor. Count your blessings. Count them, not figuratively, literally, at the end of every day. Before you get to bed, say to God, Lord, really great to have got that document drafted. Fantastic. Thank you for the deal that actually closed. Thank you for the preferential terms that I managed to get on it. Thank you for the ability that I had to speak to someone in a deal and build a good relationship with him. I think we can do business together not just once but twice. And the reason for doing that is this, is when life is tough, most of my friends come back and say, well, I feel I'm under attack and life is tough, I can't cope, I think, forces of evil are forcing things against me. Well, sometimes that does happen, and we need to know to be wise about spiritual warfare. But quite often is that they've never known what it's like to give thanks for the good things. So the only time God is brought into the equation is when things are screwed up. Well, no wonder you're going to have some sort of odd idea of what God's wanting to do in your life. So you count your blessings. Those are the habits. And then I think, last thing to say, how you view God is how you will do life. How you view Jesus is how you're going to do life. If your view of Jesus is that he is kind of like a boss, you won't express it like that, but that's kind of what you feel. He's narrow, he's prescriptive, he wants to cut the good things out of life, he's kind of demanding, you kind of do it because you should do it, because that's part of the deal, because sometimes things are quite good, so you'll go through a bit of the rough. If your view of Jesus is a reductionist view, if you reduce him to a set of do's and don'ts, then you will do life exactly the same way. You will see life as being, okay at sometimes, but not always the same. And you will see life as being miserable and hard and tough, but you would have missed the whole thing. Because the way you view Jesus, if you see him in the extraordinary grace that he has, the generosity to us when we do screw up, and when we are forgiven, and we can see him at work in our lives and in our workplaces, in our families, our relationships, in the gym, in our schools, in our universities, in the where we meet people. If we see him as one who's for us, who's died for a purpose so we might be free rather than, again, tied up, then we will see life very differently. Then we will radiate the joy that comes from him. Then we'll be able to see that there is one person who has changed our lives for the better, and given us the motivation and given us the strength and the endurance to be able to face a hostile world, to deal with the harsh compromises that we have to deal with in the workplace every day, and to come through it rejoicing in the life that is the true life, which is the life that is lived as God really intended it by the first prospectus that he gave us, called the Bible. When we live our lives according to that prospectus, then we live our lives filled with his joy and ready to take on a world that is desperate for what we have to give it. So I've said probably more than I should have. Very happy to do whatever you'd like me to do next.